Hey friends, in this video I want to talk about Romans chapter 5 verses 12 through 19, which is the epistle reading for the first Sunday in Lent in year A of the lectionary. I want to talk about just a couple of sort of preliminary things before we get into the passage itself. The first thing is, as I said, this is the epistle reading for the first Sunday in Lent. But if you look at the epistle readings throughout the season of Lent, you'll notice that the lectionary draws on Paul's epistle to the Romans several times. I think 4 out of the 6 weeks, if I remember correctly. But you'll notice that they're not in order. And so this is the reading for the first Sunday of Lent, but then the second Sunday of Lent goes back to chapter 4, and the third Sunday of Lent goes to the first half of chapter 5. And you may kind of wonder, like, well, why in the world do they do those out of order? Um, I may do another whole video just on that later on, so I'm not going to say too much about it now, but I'll just say briefly that I think part of what the lectionary is trying to do there is offer a kind of sort of progression through the spiritual life, you might say. And so because this passage sort of deals directly with sin and Christ's sort of remedy of sin, I think the creators of the lectionary thought it made for a good passage for the first Sunday in Lent. Having said that, I think the main thing I want to say here is that if you're preaching or teaching from this passage or just interested in the context of this passage, you might want to go back and watch, or maybe I should say go forward and watch the videos that I've made on Romans 4 and the first half of Romans 5 so that you can get some sense of the context that's leading up to this passage instead of me repeating all of that in this video. So, in the Canvas course or in the YouTube channel, I'll probably keep them in the order of how they appear in the lectionary, but of course you can go ahead and watch those and get the context there. I think just I'll do a really brief sense of what's leading into this passage without repeating everything in those videos, and that is that in the first, let's say, 3 chapters of Romans, Paul is sort of establishing the problem of sin and saying that Jews and Gentiles alike are under the power of sin. And that then in chapter 4, he uses Abraham as sort of an example of Jesus uh, to talk about how about how Abraham's faithfulness apart from the law is sort of like Christ making a way towards righteousness apart from the law. And so, in some ways, this passage in chapter 5 is sort of doing something similar in the sense that Paul is drawing these parallels between Abraham and Christ, that there's a certain sense in which Abraham is a type of Christ, a foreshadowing of Christ in chapter 4. We'll see in this passage that Adam is a sort of type of Christ or a foreshadowing of Christ as well. Um, in the first half of chapter 5, Paul talks about us being made righteous. So he's continuing that theme from chapter 4 with Abraham and being at peace with God because God has accomplished reconciliation with us through Christ. And so in the flow of Romans, it does sort of make sense that this passage would follow. Paul is kind of just elaborating on how it is that uh, that God through Christ provides that reconciliation, and he does so by comparing Christ to Adam. So we're going to get to that more in just a second, but I just wanted to say if you want to get more context on sort of the flow of the argument of Romans, you can go to those 2 other videos to get more detail there. One other sort of preliminary thing that I think is important in the history of interpretation of this passage, though it may not be finally the main point that I want to make, is in this very first verse. So Romans chapter 5 verse 12 reads in the Common English Bible, just as through one human being sin came into the world and death came through sin, so death has come to everyone. And then this is the part that I want to highlight right here, this since everyone has sinned. That is an important translation choice, right? By the editors or by the translators of the Common English Bible that represents really the Wesleyan tradition that the Common English Bible is sort of inspired by. I think it's a good translation. I appreciate this translation. I'm going to say why in just a second. But I do want to just note that it is a choice. And I think that in itself is an important reminder that most of the time, unless you read Greek or Hebrew, you're reading you're reading the scriptures in a translation, and translators always have to make choices. That if you've ever worked in another language besides your native language, you know that there is no one-to-one correlation. Especially, I mean, maybe sometimes there's one-to-one correlations between individual words, but once you start constructing sentences and paragraphs and complex arguments like Romans, you have to make choices about how to represent the original language in the target language, right? It's not just this one-to-one correlation. So every time we're reading in translation, choices have been made for us. And here is one of the places that you can see that. Because this has been an important verse in the history of theology, because St. Augustine, who is, arguably the most influential theologian in the history of the church, who was a bishop in North Africa in the 4th and 5th centuries, when he read this verse in Greek, he so this phrase that gets translated as sense. I'm going to see if I can write this in Greek. It might be a disaster me trying to do this with my pencil here, but what's translated as sense here in Greek is, let's see if I can do this here, is the phrase F ho. And so this is what it looks like in Greek. Again, my handwriting is terrible under normal circumstances. It's even worse working on the screen like this. Or if we were to translate it into English, it might sort of look like this. I'm sorry, that's terrible. Let me see if I can do that better. It might look like this. F ho. Now, a sort of literal translation of that. So basically this F here is a preposition, and ho is a relative pronoun. And so a sort of literal way of translating that would be in whom. And that's exactly how St. Augustine sees this verse when he reads it. And so he reads it as, just as through one human being sin came into the world, and death came through sin, so death has come to everyone, in whom all sinned, is the way that you would translate that in this case. In other words, this is a pivotal verse in St. Augustine articulating the doctrine of original sin, meaning, especially in Augustine's case, meaning that Adam sinned, and in Adam's sin, disobedience in the garden, everyone sinned, right? So there's this sense in which all of us are in Adam, and because Adam sinned, we all sinned. In whom, the whom being Adam, in whom all have sinned, is one way that you could translate this. Um, and Augustine would even go on to be sort of more specific in saying that, like, Adam's sin was actually passed on through sex, essentially through reproduction, to every subsequent human being, so that everyone is sinful from birth, right? Now, what Augustine didn't know is, because his first language was Latin, he was much more proficient in Latin and not terribly proficient in Greek, is that when you put this F ho together, it can also mean since or because, as we see here. That really changes the meaning of this verse, right? That instead of saying in whom everyone sinned, that everyone sinned in Adam, that instead you can understand that F ho as since everyone has sinned, or because everyone has sinned, right? So in other words, if we look at this verse, death didn't come to everyone just because Adam sinned. Death came to everyone because everyone has sinned, right? That's a little bit of a different notion, that it doesn't put all the culpability on Adam. Now, I do want to note that, like I said, the Common English Bible is a translation that comes out of the Wesleyan tradition. And Wesleyans still believe in original sin, though perhaps not in exactly the way that Augustine articulated it, right? Like, Wesleyans typically don't see sin as kind of like part of our DNA. Like, we don't quite understand original sin in that sense. But we do say that everyone is a sinner, that everyone has a bent towards sin, even as we also say that we believe that God's grace can work in our lives in such a way that we can be transformed and we don't have to be held captive by that sin. So that's not necessarily a part of the main point of this passage, I think, but I just wanted to note that this is an important verse in the history of Christian interpretation and the history of Christian theology and doctrine. And a lot of it comes down to this one little sort of relative clause here, this one little phrase, and the way that Augustine understood it. And then Augustine was in turn so influential that he's influenced a lot of us even up to today and continues to influence us. Okay, so those are sort of the preliminary things I wanted to talk about, but now let's get into the passage itself. So you can see, just so you can kind of see where this is headed, you can see I've made sort of this little chart down here where you've got Adam on one side and Christ on the other side. And I already mentioned at the beginning of this video that what this passage I think is really about is Adam as a kind of prototype, really sort of negative prototype of Christ, right? Because you can see that most of the things in this column under Adam are negative. And I say most because I don't necessarily think the law is negative. Again, I think Paul, as a faithful first century Jew, sees the law as a gift from God. But in this passage, I think there is a sense in which he is associating the law with sin and death and things like that. So you can see Adam's sort of a negative example, right? Or a negative prototype, that it's Adam who is disobedient, and so through that disobedience, sin enters the world. And so because sin enters the world, death also enters the world, right? So clearly we're thinking of the Genesis narrative here, where Adam is disobedient in the garden. And the way that Paul sees that, again, I think I've mentioned in some of the other videos, sin for Paul is not just disobedience. It's not just that sin and disobedience are the same thing, although they do certainly overlap. For Paul, sin, let me see if I can do a different color here. For Paul, sin is also a power that is at work in the world. So when Adam sins, yes, he's disobedient, and that is a sin. But Paul's actually saying a bit more than that. He's sort of saying, like, Adam's disobedience opened the door to the power of sin to enter into God's creation in a way that it had been excluded previously. And so now that sin has entered the world, this power of sin has entered the world, it is able to corrupt God's good creation. And so as a result, death also enters in. And so these are all the things that happen with Adam. On the other hand, when we get into the second paragraph, you can see all the more positive things with Christ, right? Whereas Adam is disobedient, Christ is faithful, right? Whereas Adam allows sin to enter the world, Christ brings righteousness. Whereas Adam brings death, Christ brings life. And I do want to be careful here. I mean, I've put law and grace on the bottom of this list, and there are certain ways in which Paul is opposing those, making those a dichotomy here. But again, I want to emphasize that I don't think this is really exact here because, again, as a first century Jew, Paul sees God's law as a kind of grace, right? It is a gift that God has given to the Jewish people. Nevertheless, in this particular passage, he does sort of put them on opposing sides of the equation. He's going to deal with that more in chapter 7, which we're actually not going to talk about in any of these videos because it doesn't come up as a lectionary passage in the season of Lent in year A in the lectionary. But if you want to see how Paul sort of rescues the law as a good thing, so to speak, you can read Romans 7. But he asks the question in Romans 7, does that mean that the law is evil? And he says, no, the law is holy and righteous and good. But he goes on to say, it's the power of sin that corrupted the law that caused me to do the very things that I didn't want to do. All right, I'm not going to go any further down that path because this video is surely already entirely too long. But you can read Romans 7 if you want to see what Paul does with the law. Okay, so now that we've sort of talked about these kind of parallels here, let's go back and look at the passage itself so that you can kind of see how this works out, right? So let's get some of this stuff out of the way here so we can see a little bit better. So Just as through one human being, that's Adam, sin came into the world, so you see that there, and death came through sin, so death has come to everyone since everyone has sinned. So in a sense, that's the problem, right? That death has come to everyone. Although sin was in the world, since there was no law, it wasn't taken into account until the law came. So if you go back and look at chapter 3, verse 20 of Romans, you'll see there, so that's Romans 3:20, you'll see there that Paul says something like, through the law comes the knowledge of sin, right? In fact, that's, in Paul's mind, that's what the law does. It tells you what is sinful and what isn't. And so you see he's basically reiterating that same idea here, right? He's saying where there was no law, sin wasn't taken into the account until the law came. But, verse 14, even though it wasn't taken into account, that doesn't mean that it wasn't doing its work, right? But death ruled from Adam, so when the sin entered the world, until Moses, when the law was given, even over those who didn't sin. Now, in this case, we're talking about specifically disobedience, who didn't sin in the same way Adam did. Adam was a type of the one who was coming, and that's what the next paragraph is going to be about, that Adam is this type of Christ, right? But Paul is saying here, even though there was no law before Moses, sin still entered the world in Adam, and it still did its corrupting work, right? It still did its corrosive work of God's good creation. It still twisted things, even though there was no law to point it out, to say, hey, this is what sin is, right? Um, Going on to verse 15. Now here we have the contrast. Notice the but again, right? So this is what happens through Adam, but the free gift of Christ isn't like Adam's failure. If many people died through what one person did wrong, God's grace is multiplied even more for many people with the gift. And I want to emphasize the even more here, and you see I've sort of put this lesser than symbol here, to emphasize that even though Paul is making these parallels between Adam and Christ, he also wants to make it clear that what Christ did is greater, right? That what Christ did is more. So it's not that Christ just sort of is an exact parallel to Adam and just reverses what Adam does, but he actually does even more, right? So is multiplied even more for many people with the gift of the one person, Jesus Christ, that comes through grace. The gift, he says, isn't like the consequence of one person's sin. The judgment that came from one person's sin led to punishment, but the free gift that came out of many failures led to the verdict of acquittal. If death ruled because of one person's failure, those who receive the multiplied grace and the gift of righteousness will even more certainly rule in life through the one person, Jesus Christ. And I think that verse 17 here, oops, sorry, wrong tool. Let's try again. That verse 17 here is the point of this passage, right? The point is, if death and sin entered the world through Adam, which he says if, but I think Paul takes for granted that his audience agrees with that, right? I think there's a sense of which, like, okay, we all know, we being Paul's audience here, right? There's a sense in which we all know sin and death entered the world through one man, right? That, I think, is what is taken for granted. He's assuming everybody in his audience agrees with that statement. So he's saying, hey, if that's true, if such a bad thing can happen through one person, then a really awesome thing can happen through one person too, right? I think is essentially the argument. That if Adam allowed in the undoing of God's creation, then Christ, who is greater than Adam, right, who is the very Son of God, and he said back in the very first verses of the epistle in chapter 1, proclaimed to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection of the dead, right? Then all these good things can come through Christ, right? Christ can undo what Adam did, and even more than that, bring the gift of righteousness, right? So in many ways, Paul is really continuing the argument that he's been making since the second half of 3 and on through 4 and the first half of 5 and now into this passage, that it is Christ who has opened this door to a new righteousness apart from the law, as he said in 3:21, even though it is witnessed to by the law and the prophets. And so That, I think, is the main theme of this passage and the main theme for the first Sunday of Lent. That Adam allowed in sin and death by his disobedience, but that Christ has reversed what Adam did. That through Christ's faithfulness, righteousness and life have been brought into the world and are possible for us to experience, uh, just as what Adam did allowed sin and death into the world. But he wants to say that what Christ has done is even greater, right? Now, just a little foreshadowing to the next chapter in Romans, because I think it's important as a kind of balance to this chapter. Even though chapter 6 is there are no lectionary readings in Lent from chapter 6, but I think it's worth noting that in the very next chapter, in chapter 6, um, Paul will sort of ask the question of like, uh, so what should we say then? Does this sort of just mean that like, I mean, if Adam let in all this bad stuff and that sort of automatically corrupted us, does that mean that Christ's faithfulness like automatically makes us good, automatically makes us righteous? And he'll say, no, like it's not automatic. Like you need Christ's grace in order to be able to respond to what Christ has done, but it's not automatic that you have to make a choice, right? And that's really what chapter 6 is all about. So it might be good to sort of, as you think about this passage or preach and teach from this passage, to also take a just quick look at chapter 6 and think about the way that Paul is developing this argument further on. So that is Romans 5:12 to 19.